talking about my favorite Marvel Comics character, the Italian vigilante named Francis Castiglione. Of course, you might know him better as Frank Castle, aka the Punisher. Actually, when I think about Frank's real name being Francis, I can't help but think of the Deadpool movie and wonder if Deadpool was ever brave enough to tease Frank about his name like he did Ajax.
Probably you would.
but but I digress. The Punisher's brutality and willingness to kill made him stand out among other Marvel characters who were not willing to cross those lines when he debuted in the Amazing Spider-Man number 129 in February of 1974. But by the late 1980s, the Punisher was just one of many psychologically troubled anti-heroes in Marvel Comics, as well as in other publishers. Um, at the height of his popularity in the early 90s, the Punisher was featured in 4 monthly publications, which is it's pretty big for any character to have 4 titles going. The Punisher War Journal, the Punisher War Zone, and the Punisher Armory. Uh, I mean, this is a testament to the Punisher's popularity. They put out a book where it's just the Punisher sitting around talking about his weapons, and everybody bought it up.
I did.
Jerry, right? Jerry Conway, the creator of the character, said the Punisher's popularity actually took him by surprise, as he had only intended him to be a second-tier character. But he definitely did not stay that way, did he, Steve?
Oh, no, not at all. Frank Miller's legendary run on Daredevil was probably one of the biggest turning points for the Punisher. Miller put Daredevil and Punisher into conflict in the first of many meetings between those two. And its encounter makes perfect sense, with Matt Murdock as the champion of law and order against Punisher, who embodies cold, hard vengeance. Miller could do no wrong back then, and the Daredevil versus Punisher story had a lasting impact on both characters. This story was so enduring, in fact, that it led to a long standing rivalry between them. I also suspect that this story was a huge boost to Punisher's popularity as well.
I think you're right about that. At least aside from the vengeance part. I
Hmm.
mean, not to be a stickler, but I think, well, Frank does his share of retaliation. I believe Frank would call it punishment rather than vengeance. I mean, I realize we're just talking about semantics here, but in this particular case, I think it matters for the character. Um, but let's move on to your point about the Daredevil Punisher story. During his acclaimed run on Daredevil, Frank Miller did, as you said, use the Punisher's attitudes particular brand of vigilante justice as a contrast to Daredevil's more liberal character and belief in the system. Later on, Ennis would capitalize on this contrast with writing the infamous scene where Daredevil is chained up on the roof with one arm just free enough to fire the gun that's taped to his hand with his finger on the trigger. The Punisher is about to kill a real piece of shit that even Daredevil hates, and all Daredevil has to do is fire the gun and kill Punisher to stop him. The problem is that doing that makes Daredevil just like the Punisher, proving that Frank was right all along. It's a brutal scene, and you can actually find it in the Punisher Welcome Back Frank trade.
Oh yeah, that was a great moment. As much as I love that run and I appreciate Garth Ennis as a writer, I generally take issue with this handling of big two superheroes for the most part, as anybody who's read The Boys can attest. This is one of the exceptions to that, though. You can tell whose side Ennis favors on the question, but I feel like Daredevil got at least a bit more respect here, and certainly more than he does in Confederacy of Dunces in the Marvel Knights run. It's a really strong scene that gets Frank's side of the argument down better than you see in most of their fights, which I really like. But all in all, I generally like their meetings, as Daredevil and Punisher are very different but valid viewpoints. Daredevil's the guy who believes in the system and giving it a chance to work, while Punisher thinks the system has failed and believes justice is best served with a bullet. What I love about their fights is that they tend to be ideological, and at their best, they make you wonder which of them is really right. Those are the most interesting conflicts to me. Both sides are totally committed to their beliefs, but their clash of ideologies means they'll come to blows from time to time.
Honestly, that struggle of those ideologies between those two characters is one of my favorites in comics. I love that they both simultaneously can see the other person's point of view, that there is a place for it in the world, but they desperately try to convince each other of what they believe to be the right way.
Oh, true. And sometimes they'll work together from time to time if the need arises. Despite their differences, they both draw the line at innocent people being killed. Frank will only kill someone if he's certain that person deserves punishment. and he will never hurt innocents or allow others to hurt them. He also draws a line to killing cops, and he's reluctant to kill cops even if they're corrupt, which is interesting. On occasion, Frank and Matt have been known to put their own feud aside if that means saving others. And I think this is what sets Frank apart from a lot of gritty anti-heroes. He has a clear code he never deviates from, and he never compromises on it. I think my realization of this is where I started to respect the Punisher, and it took Garth Ennis to get me there. When did you become interested in the Punisher, Mike?
I've personally been a fan of the Punisher since I was a teenager. It was the '90s, and anti-heroes were all the rage back then. But there were a few things about Frank Castle that set him apart from the other anti-heroes of the day for me, along with Punisher's strict code, as you pointed out. The first is that the Punisher has an intense focus. He exercises extreme mental discipline that enables him to resist most psychic and telepathic powers that are used against him. When Letha and Lascivious try to manipulate Frank's aggression, for example, he scoffs at their attempts, saying it doesn't feel any different than any other day. Or when Ghost Rider gives Frank the penitent stare, and it has no effect on him, because in his eyes what he does is not a sin, and he has no regrets about his actions at all. Frank Castle is strong in both mind and body. It's the same reason I like Batman.
I can get behind that. I will say that I respect his level of commitment to his cause and his personal code. He just will not surrender or compromise in any way. This can sometimes be a problem, which is why he tends to alienate friends. They make compromises with the world that Frank simply refuses to do. But while I haven't read that story with Ghost Rider, that actually does make sense to me. Frank is acting out of his own sense of morality. It's just that his idea of morality goes against the rules of society and the legal system. In his mind, he's dispensing old school justice on the people he kills. There's something refreshing about a character who's that single minded in his purpose.
Well said. While an honorable code and lack of compromise in one's belief is respectable and even inspiring, at the same time, compromise is a part of life, and the rest of the world outside of Frank's window. But ultimately, I've always seen Frank as a lone wolf, and I think he's accepted that as well, and that tends to come across as hard and cold a lot. But there are also times when Frank clearly has a big heart too, like with Viorica, the sex slave. Human trafficking is something that Frank would clearly put a stop to anyway, but he also felt compassion and sympathy for her and her situation in The Punisher Max Volume 5, The Slavers. The second thing I love about the Punisher is this. While I like superpowers, I mean they're cool, everybody loves them, but there is something about characters that are just human, and all of their powers, in quotations, there come from hard work, training, and education, and of course, just being a natural badass. I believe Frank Castle has one of the highest pain tolerance in Marvel Comics. I think actually only Daredevil is on his level, but I'm hardly a Marvel expert. Could you chime in on this one, Steve?
Among street level characters, Daredevil would definitely be up there with a sheer refusal to give up after taking the worst physical and psychological beatings in the world. If Captain America counts, I'd also list him. He has the same level of resolve and commitment to his values that Frank does to his own. Frank deeply respects Cap, even though they also have huge ideological differences for this reason. Both of them have been through the fires of war and came out the other side as the greatest soldier in their respective wars. Aside from that, though, I'm drawing a blank in terms of heroes, though I think Doctor Doom could give Frank a run for his money as well in terms of pain tolerance and willpower. But yes, I can appreciate the fact that Frank's skills come from years of training and discipline. I like a lot of the street level characters for that reason, and Frank is that kind of character for sure.
Yeah, yeah. The last thing that really sets the Punisher apart from other anti-heroes, actually, at least for me, stems from the fact that I have a lot of respect for those that have served in the military. And if you're listening to this and you have served or do serve in the U.S. military, I want to thank you for your service right now. Um, my respect for soldiers is actually so great, in fact, that even when fictional characters serve, it immediately endears them to me. And Frank Castle was originally a Vietnam veteran, is portrayed in The Punisher Invades the Nam from 1994 and The Punisher #6 from 2000. But his military service was later updated to being a veteran of the global war on terrorism in The Punisher #7 from 2014. Well, I prefer the Vietnam version. Either way, Frank Castle is a U.S. Marine, and that's even my favorite branch of the military. I talk about Frank's training being one of the reasons I love the character a few minutes ago, but I did not get into specifics. Frank Castle has been through intense infantry training from the United States Marine Corps and special operations training by Force Recon. As a recon Marine, he went through airborne school, Ranger school, and SEER, I believe is how you would pronounce that, which is survival, evasion, resistance, and escape. He also did cross training with Australian SASR during the Vietnam War. Because of all this training, the Punisher has a long list of skills and abilities, including a great proficiency in marksmanship, basic infantry, special operations, including guerrilla warfare, infiltration, including various forms of camouflage and stealth, assassination, capture, and intelligence gathering. He's also highly proficient in a variety of hand-to-hand combat styles and martial arts styles, including Chin Na, Hua Rang Do, Krav Maga, Muay Thai, Nas Ryu Jiu Jitsu, Ninjitsu, Shirin Ryu Karate, and Sistema. And last but not least, he is trained in the use and maintenance of specialized firearms, equipment, and explosive ordnance. To paraphrase Hudson from Aliens, Frank Castle is the ultimate badass, state of the badass art.
Oh yeah, and that's really a great line to go with. I share your sentiments on the military. Although I haven't personally served, a number of my family members have served those, so I can tell you that it is a real commitment and it is worthy of respect. As for Frank, I like how grounded he is in military life and what actual warfare is like, at least to the extent that I can understand it with the experience I have. There are times in fiction where you can tell the writer is trying to write soldiers without really knowing what that life is like. But with Frank Castle, I always got the sense that when he's written well, his background in the Marine Corps feels authentic and true to the realities of what his war was probably like. And I have to say, I am definitely in the camp that thinks that Frank Castle should be a Vietnam veteran. I get that the sliding time scale of comics means you have to choose between realism and character authenticity. Everything has to be 10 years ago to the big two, so I grant that a Vietnam vet would be really old in the modern Marvel universe. And there are some characters you can update in that way and it still works, like Ben Grimm or Tony Stark. However, I feel like Frank Castle is defined by Vietnam so completely as a character that I don't think you can take him out of it without losing something. To me, it's like taking Cap out of World War II. Punisher Born probably handled that problem as well as it could be done, although imperfectly. I always interpreted the deal that Frank made in Bourne as a pact with someone like Death. Frank was promised a war that lasts forever, so to me it makes sense if Death was slowing or stopping his aging process somehow. We know this being was the reason he survived the Battle of Firebase Valley Forge because he admitted to it. It's mentioned vaguely enough that you can read it in different ways, but I feel like that's a reasonable explanation for why a Vietnam veteran would still be around in the 2020s and killing mobsters by the truckload.
Yeah, that is. I actually didn't. I didn't really pick up on that when I first when I first read that, but I did like that supernatural aspect to some degree. But at the same time, I'm glad they didn't lean hard into that in the Max series. I did, however, like that Frank was clearly the Punisher before he ever came back from the war and Bourne. I feel that mirrors the experience of soldiers who served during wartime. You know, whoever you were before you killed a man, before you were covered in the guts of a friend and experienced every matter of morbidity and the macabre, is just gone. Switching from being an honored killing machine to a civilian can be almost impossible for some. They just can't turn it off. Frank's case, he didn't turn it off, he turned it up. Frank is driven by that and the deaths of his wife and children, who were killed by the mob for witnessing a killing in New York City's Central Park. Because of that, Frank is willing to cross lines that even other anti-heroes were not to carry out his one-man war on crime. And I think that this is because he is military trained and has experience fighting an actual war. He just views it differently. It's about numbers and taking down the leaders of the enemy's forces. I mean, this is war, not a game. While most anti-heroes are so because of their willingness to kill and their tendency to be antisocial, with the Punisher, murder was a given. At the very least, people were going to die. But the Punisher is not against kidnapping, extortion, coercion, threats of violence, and straight-up torture. There are very few lines he won't cross in his war. Not only is it his duty to him, he personally hates the criminals he's at war with, as if they are the very mobsters that killed his family.
Oh, very true. The death of Frank's family is the moment when Frank fully became the Punisher. It's easy to think that Punisher is like Batman in the sense that he's motivated to avenge the murders of his family. But I think with the Punisher, it's more complicated than it is with Batman, no matter which version you go with. Bruce's childhood was shaped by pain and loss, but he was raised by people who inspired him to do good as Batman. With Frank, we're dealing with a man who lived through 3 tours of duty in a brutal war that was lost, where he saw moral compromise, disillusionment, and senseless death for years on end. Deep down, that part of him gets a taste for blood and death, and then he comes home and his family is murdered, again senselessly. All of that adds up. I see Frank as trying to make the world making sense, no matter what the cost is or he has to kill to do it. That is at once both inspiring and frightening, and I think that what's making him so fascinating to watch. Now, I will admit that unlike a lot of mainstream Marvel and DC characters, the Punisher is not one of those characters where I know the minutiae of his history. And part of the reason for this is that for the longest time, I just didn't like the Punisher that much. I really didn't go along with his way of doing things, and the Punisher himself can sometimes be a real jerk, even to his closest friends, and that turned me off from him for years. I paid attention to certain stories involving him, especially his meetings with Daredevil, but I didn't really get into the Punisher until later. That changed with Garth Ennis, who made me rethink the character, but we'll get into that run soon enough. But Ennis's run created a different barrier of a different kind to me. Ennis was so definitive that now he's not the Punisher to me unless Ennis is writing him. So I have a hard time getting into the post Ennis stuff too.
I can actually feel you there, 100%. Ennis wrote the Punisher like he was born to do it, and yes, pun intended. I'll give you that. I don't think that anyone is ever going to surpass the bar that he set as far as writing Punisher goes. But at the same time, I believe that others have done well. I mean, even if they didn't quite understand the character as fully and completely as Ennis does.
Oh, I'll give you that. And there is one other writer I'll mention later who has come very close for me. At the same time, there are things that draw me to Frank Castle, things that Ennis had to point out to me. I respect how committed Castle is to his code, and I respect that he will always value innocent lives even over punishing the guilty. Beyond that, I appreciate Frank Castle as a hero that's a product of the Vietnam War. I have not mentioned this, but my father served as a loadmaster during Vietnam in the Air Force, so that may be a reason why I turned around on Frank. Vietnam shaped Frank Castle in his 3 tours of duty, and I love him when he's in that setting. Oddly, I think I like Frank more as the hero of a war story than as a character in a superhero comic, if that makes sense. He's a character who was literally plucked out of the men's adventure genre and dressed up in superhero trappings, something that his creator, Jerry Conway, openly admitted to doing eventually. But I get ahead of myself. Mike, why don't we talk about how Frank Castle was born?
I love how you put that. Sure thing. The Punisher, originally called the Assassin, was created by Jerry Conway, artist John Romita Sr., and ultimately drawn by artist Ross Andrew for publication. Conway, then writer of The Amazing Spider Man, was inspired by The Executioner, a popular book series created by author Don Pendleton, in which a Vietnam veteran named Mac Bolan becomes a serial killer of criminals after the mafia related deaths of his family. Conway described the inspiration in an interview from 1987, saying that he was fascinated by the Don Pendleton execution character, which was fairly popular at the time, and he wanted to do something that was inspired by that, although not, in his opinion, an exact copy. I'm going to say he failed. Well, it may not have been an exact copy uh, but from what I can tell, Conway's Punisher is pretty darn close to this Executioner character. In my opinion, you could easily write the Punisher instead of the Executioner in that description, and nobody would be able to tell the difference.
Yeah, I have to agree with that. I mean, more than likely that is the case. I mean, even Conway admitted that his goal was to do his own version of the Executioner, but he may have hit too close to the mark. Admittedly, I haven't read any of those books, so I can't say how exactly close he comes. But just from the basic concept of the description, it just seems like the only real difference is that Castle operates in a superhero universe and the very distinctive design for the character. So why don't we talk about the Punisher's visual design?
Sure. As far as the look of the assassin, Conway helped design the character's distinctive costume. As Conway recalled in 2002, in the 70s, when I was writing comics at DC and Marvel, I made a practice to sketch my own ideas for the costumes of new characters, heroes, and villains, which I offered to the artist as a crude suggestion representing the image I had in mind. I had done that with the Punisher at Marvel. Conway had drawn a character with a small death's head skull on one breast. Marvel art director John Romita Sr. took the basic design and blew up the skull to a huge size, taking up most of the character's chest. The assassin's uniform is made of Kevlar, which protects him from most gunfire, though it can still suffer concussive injury or even penetration of his armor from sufficient force or repeated impacts. The white skull emblem that John Romita Sr. had blown up so big on the assassin's chest is used to both intimidate his enemies and to lure their fire to the more heavily protected area of his armor, like what Batman does with his bat symbol on his chest, but blown up to cover more surface area.
I think this was where the visual element that cemented Punisher as a character. It's a striking visual that encapsulates exactly who he is as a character. He brings death to the guilty. I think it makes sense to make the skull large and have it cover his chest, and I like how sometimes his belt capsules look like teeth. It's just a really great design, and I think the black leather jacket that was added later on and adds another cool touch, though that wouldn't come along for decades.
It really did cement that look. I bet there are those who may not know anything about the character, but still know that giant skull that he wears. It is iconic, like Superman's S or Batman's symbol. It's just instantly recognizable. As far as the name Assassin goes, Stan Lee, then Marvel's editor in chief, recalled in 2005 that he had suggested the character's name. Apparently, Jerry Conway wanted a character that would turn out to be a hero later on, and he came up with the name Assassin for it. But Stan Lee mentioned that he didn't think they could ever actually have a comic where the hero would be called the Assassin because there was just too much of a negative connotation to that word. Uh, Sometime before that, however, Stan had created a relatively unimportant character who was one of Galactus's robots called the Punisher, and Stan thought that was a good name for Jerry Conway's new character, so Stan suggested it. And since Stan was the editor, Jerry Conway said okay.
Yeah, I will say that I'm aware of that character, and it's so forgettable that it really kind of was not a problem with that. No question that Stan was absolutely right on this question, though not entirely for the reasons that he gave. I think the problem with Frank calling himself the assassin is that he doesn't look at himself that way. He's not somebody like Bullseye, who's a professional hitman, for example. I think that Frank Castle sees himself as someone who's fighting what he considers a just war against evil. The Punisher makes far more sense as a name because he believes that he's punishing the guilty. It just fits him perfectly and emphasizes his worldview.
Agreed. Agreed. That name doesn't really fit Frank's character, and I think it was more in line actually with what the Executioner character did. Um, but let's talk about Punisher's first appearance in the 74 issue of The Amazing Spider Man, number 129. The story goes something like this. The Punisher, who is working with the Jackal, is determined to kill Spider Man, who is wanted for the apparent murder of Norman Osborn. But there is more to the Punisher than that. The Punisher is frustrated over his self appointed role of killer vigilante in that issue, a problem he definitely doesn't have later on. He also does an extensive amount of soul searching as to what's the right thing to do, and he gets pissed when Jackal claws Spider Man's head, citing it as an unjust means of execution, which is another big thing that would change about the character. In fact, when it is later revealed that the Jackal killed the mechanic, Punisher's weapon supplier, by clawing him rather than using honorable combat, the Punisher turns his sights towards the Jackal instead of Spider Man.
Yeah, as you mentioned, Castle is working with the Jackal to take down Spider-Man. If that sounds strange to you, this actually does make some sense in context. At this point, the Punisher doesn't know that Jackal is a villain or anything that we as an audience might know about him. Also, at that time, Norman Osborn had just died, and Spidey at the time took the blame for it. All of this in addition to the usual bad press that Spidey almost always got from Jonah Jameson. So this issue really is a misunderstanding battle rather than Punisher being a villain in the traditional sense.
Right, right. Jameson was even feeding the fire in his usual jerky fashion, saying that Punisher is the most newsworthy thing to happen in New York since Boss Tweed, which, if you know anything about New York history, is a pretty bold statement. I
Yeah.
mean, I get it, but I think that it shows where Jameson's heart really lies, and it's not with concern for the city. But as you said, Spidey and Frank fighting was a misunderstanding due to manipulation from a third party, i.e., the Jackal.
Right. For all that he's labeled as a villain at first, we do see the heroic qualities of Frank Castle in the story. He's still that uncompromising, grim figure of vengeance who operates by his own set of rules and never deviates from them. The character's still unrefined in the story, and I don't see this kind of story working for a modern Punisher story. But for its time, it was a good enough introduction to the character.
Unrefined is the perfect way to describe his first appearance, in my opinion. Really, I love who the Punisher became rather than who he started out as. Speaking of which, why don't you tell us a bit about who all has worked on the Punisher over the years to shape him into who we know and love today?
Oh, absolutely, and I agree with you on that point. The one who got the ball rolling with the Punisher was writer Stephen Grant, who I mainly know from an indie comic about a ninja named Whisper. He broke into Marvel because he was rooming with someone in Marvel's production department, and he made some pitches to then editor-in-chief Marv Wolfman. One of those was for the Punisher. Though it took Grant years of lobbying, he eventually managed to get a Punisher miniseries off the ground with the help of artist Mike Zeck. The success of that mini led to a Punisher ongoing series, which was launched by Mike Baron and Klaus Janson. Um, Grant and Baron would work on Punisher for years after this. Over time, the Punisher became a huge deal. The main Punisher book lasted for 104 issues, and his star steadily rose during that time. But believe it or not, the Punisher ended up being a vehicle for hot, up and coming artists in the late 80s and early 90s. The success of the main Punisher title merited a spin off called Punisher War Journal. The artist on that book would probably stun people today. Punisher War Journal features some early work by none other than Jim Lee. It was his success on book like Punisher that led to Lee eventually moving on to doing the X-Men. And he wasn't the only image creator to draw that book. Will Sportacio, who also ended up becoming known for X-Men books, drew issues of Punisher as well. There were some decent writers on the Punisher at the time. Dan Abnett and Andy Lanning did some stories together, for example. But the artist got more attention on Punisher back at that time.
That's a pretty impressive list. I didn't know about Jim Lee's Punisher, at least not since I like really became aware of Jim Lee and became a fan of his. I'm gonna have to do some digging and pick that stuff up. I just love Jim Lee's art. But there weren't just big names working on Punisher. These guys brought in some characters that became essential to the Punisher story. Why don't you tell us a little bit about that?
Sure. There was one notable supporting character in Frank's life around this time, and that was Linus Microchip Lieberman. Microchip was created by Mike Baron and Klaus Janson, and he was intended as the Q to Punisher's James Bond. Micro also had lost family to criminals. His nephew was killed by the Kingpin's men, and he also lost a son to the Punisher's war on crime. So he's helping Frank because he sympathizes with Frank's cause, and they become very close friends and almost war buddies in a sense. Micro was also the humanizing influence on Frank, understanding his mission without fully becoming like him. However, it was also a very dysfunctional relationship because Micro's humanity also meant he struggled a lot more with the consequences of their war on crime. Frank could sometimes be a complete jerk to Micro, in one instance, spying on him while he was visiting his therapist. For all that, though, Micro is probably the closest thing that Frank has to a friend, and he was a really good character during his time with Frank.
For me, that's what made Frank killing Microchip in the Punisher Max series so devastating. I mean, presumed dead for some time, Microchip had returned to attempt to pressure Frank into working for the CIA's Black Ops unit to hunt down terrorists. But the Punisher declines as he prefers his autonomy to indentured service to an institution like the government. Microchip confesses to Castle that the source of the funding for the operation came from the CIA funneling arms and heroin out of Afghanistan, and he was part of that, which put Microchip basically on the same level as the other scumbags that Punisher kills. I knew Frank could be cold, and to be fair, Frank offered him a chance to run, but Microchip refused, feeling obligated to help Castle in the firefight they were in. Taking a mortal injury in the fight, Micro attempts to humanize Castle again, I believe as an attempt actually to save his own life, but he was just met with a point-blank shotgun blast to the head.
I know exactly what you mean, and I still have mixed feelings about that story. On the one hand, I wish that they hadn't killed Micro because there are very few good supporting characters in Frank's life. Certainly few real friends. On the other hand, I can't deny that the story was really good, and it makes perfect sense for things to end that way between them. Micro, by that point, had compromised himself too much for someone like Frank to ever accept him by that point. It's a sad ending, but it's an appropriate one. Although Ennis has eclipsed virtually everyone on this character, though there is one other writer who's strongly associated with the Punisher, and that person is Chuck Dixon, who wrote Punisher in the 80s and 90s before moving to DC and his lengthy run on the Batman titles. Garth Ennis even credited Dixon for having written some very good stories with the Punisher, which for him is a rare honor. Looking back through some of Dixon's work, you can see where some of it influenced Ennis. But I think what set Chuck Dixon apart from most Punisher writers is that he understood the genres that shape the character. Punisher is not at his core a superhero. He is a war and men's adventure hero who just happens to be an urban crime fighter. I believe this is what Ennis saw in him, not being connected to the superhero genre. But it was Dixon who first seemed to really get that. Dixon was drawn to those genres himself, and one of his strengths was in writing war comics. In fact, he wrote a Vietnam era war comic called The Nam around the time that he was doing Punisher. And if that sounds like a natural crossover to you, that's because it is. Dixon's Punisher drew more on action heroes like Dirty Harry and the Clint Eastwood archetype, which Ennis would also do to some extent in his run. So Dixon's stories were gritty 80s action comics and war comics, and those were the kinds of stories the Punisher thrived on.
And I have not read Dixon's work on the Punisher, but you have me sold on it. I'm going to try and pick some of that up.
Oh, I still need to read more myself. I mean, there's a lot of it, and it's still not all in comicsology yet. But Dixon's first crack at Punisher came with a short graphic novel project called Kingdom Gone, and it was popular enough that he was invited to do work on the regular titles. Dixon did at least some issues on all the Punisher books at one point or another, though he's most strongly associated with Punisher War Journal and Punisher Warzone, which he debuted with John Romita Jr. Dixon is known for being extremely fast in getting scripts out, so by the end of his run, he churned out a whopping 71 issues on the Punisher titles, not counting appearances he wrote in other books. Now, I'll admit I have not read everything that Dixon wrote on the Punisher, but I can talk about a few highlights and some stories that may have had an impact on Garth Ennis.
Man, you've got me drooling over this Dixon stuff. I've only read a bit of it in Punisher War Journal and Punisher Warzone, but it'll be interesting looking back through it again when I get it, in light of being a major influence for Ennis's Punisher.
Funny you should mention that. Probably the most influential Punisher book that Dixon wrote was Punisher Warzone, drawn by John Romita Jr. And I'll be honest, this may be my favorite Punisher story not written by Ennis. It pretty much starts with Punisher being such a jerk to Micro that Micro gets fed up and leaves. This puts Frank in a position where he needs to get information, which he can't get because he doesn't have Micro to do his legwork for him. So the Punisher decides to infiltrate an Italian crime family with the help of a low-level enforcer posing as a cousin named Johnny Tower. While undercover, Punisher kills off the family's rivals while gradually moving his way up the food chain. But eventually things start to go wrong when Castle and his unwilling partner, Mickey Fondozzi, botch the assassination of the boss's brother, Sal. This leads to a series of events where Frank's club cover is blown at the worst possible time, and Frank has to salvage the situation while killing all the mobsters. I will also add that the first issue features an iconic scene used in the films, where Frank strings Mickey upside down from the ceiling and then threatens to torture him with a blowtorch. If you like that scene in the first movie, it's even better in the comic, especially as drawn by Romita Jr.
I can
And
second that.
yeah, yeah. There's also a Dixon Punisher story that I suspect had an influence on Bourne and Ennis's other Vietnam stories. There's a series of stories collected as Punisher Invades the Nam, where Dixon showed the history of Frank Castle in Vietnam. Dixon wrote the Nam at the time, and for an arc, he wrote an arc about a younger Frank Castle. Like Ennis, I think Dixon didn't believe that Frank Castle's war started with the murder of his family. That was just a catalyst. Dixon seemed to think that what molded the Punisher was Vietnam and the horrors that he fought through while he was there. The Dixon story deals with Frank fighting at Khe Sanh during the Tet Offensive, which is something Ennis would later revisit in Punisher the Platoon. The story is as a war story told by Ice Phillips, who is someone that Castle fought with, though it's not clear how much of that actually happened, especially since Platoon changes a lot of about Frank's first tour. But along the way, Frank gets mixed up in corruption on his own side, involving a scheme to take money from disaffected soldiers trying to get out of the war and then setting them up to be murdered. This is where we begin to see how Frank starts to realize that the system doesn't work, leading him to take matters into his own hands. I don't think it's as good as Ennis's war stories with Frank, but I think you get a good idea of how Dixon may have influenced them.
I'm seeing what you mean about Dixon being one of the first to really get the character. He really did, even though, as you said, and I agree, Ennis did it better. Dixon clearly laid the groundwork. And while I had not read it, it sounds like Ennis's The Platoon and Bourne would make actually good bookends.
Oh, I think they would. Platoon centers around Castle taking his first command. It's an interesting story in that Castle is a straight up war hero in this one, though he's still hard and relentless. Platoon is Frank's first tour of duty in Nam, and Bourne is his third. If you compared Platoon and Bourne, you see the story of a good soldier who changes into a man hardened by war. My hope is that Ennis eventually does one last miniseries to show us Frank's second tour, since that fills in the blanks and shows us how he changed. Ennis has said that he has this story in mind, so I'm guessing it's just a matter of when Marvel puts it out there.
That would be awesome. I actually kind of wonder if it would involve the initial meeting with Death or whoever it was that Frank was talking to in Punisher Born.
Oh, that would be really cool. But getting back to Vietnam, Dixon also brings Ice Phillips from the Nam into a present day Punisher story and what Ice has been up to since the war ended. Ice becomes a private detective, and he's essentially a mercenary in his later years. Ice and Frank meet while Ice is on the trail of a rich girl who's been sucked into a right wing extremist cult. Frank thinks that the girl can't be saved, while Ice just wants to save the girl for the money. It's a story I like mainly for the relationship between Frank and Ice than because of the story itself. And I like seeing Frank's past in the war catch up with him. But all in all, I'd say if you like Ennis's Punisher, then the Dixon stuff comes the closest to capturing the magic that I've read. Some of it's the influence that Dixon had on Ennis, and some of it's just that Dixon understood what made the character work better than most writers who have handled the character, in my view.
All right, all right. Well, what would you say are the can't miss books from Dixon's run?
Well, aside from what I've already mentioned, I'd also add River of Blood from Warzone. This story is notable in part because of the art. The late, great Joe Kubert joined Dixon on a story involving Punisher taking on the Russian mafia. Along the way, Frank meets up with a Russian vigilante called Dragunov, who is so hardcore that, as crazy as it sounds, Frank comes across as the reasonable one by comparison. This leads,
Shit.
yeah, this leads to a merry chase across Eastern Europe for a group of Russian mafiosos who are using drug money to acquire nuclear weapons and then sell them to the highest bidder. Each issue gets bigger and crazier, and it feels like a globe-trotting adventure. Joe Kubert's art really gets across the exotic landscapes and the gritty urban warfare, and Dixon does good international intrigue stuff. I wish they'd done more books together because Chuck Dixon and Joe Kubert on Punisher is a match made in comics heaven. I'll also add that, as an aside, that Dixon's later run on the Marvel Knights title does some fun Punisher versus Daredevil stuff, even involving characters like Black Widow, Moon Knight, and Shang-Chi. But around the mid 90s, unfortunately, the book starts heading into ridiculous territory. Um, Eventually, the grim and gritty trend starts to fade, and the interest in the Punisher starts to fade with it. This led to Marvel doing more and more desperate things to raise interest in the character. Probably the silliest of these things, though, is the time when they turned Frank Castle into a literal angel of death. Welcome Back, Frank very vaguely references this in the beginning. Also, Ennis can hand wave it all away to do his own thing. And that leads into the most awesome Punisher comics ever made. Mike, do you want to talk about that?
I sure would. It all started with Marvel Knights and a 12-issue miniseries by Garth Ennis and Steve Dillon. simply titled The Punisher, that ran from April 2000 to March 2001. It was later collected into a trade and called Welcome Back, Frank. The basic synopsis of the miniseries would go like this. Frank, still a Vietnam War veteran in this version, reestablishes himself in New York City by taking on the Ganucci crime syndicate. Detective Soap, whom you see later in the Punisher Warzone movie, is assigned to catch the Punisher, but it's all just PR, as the police secretly condone his actions, something Ennis dips back into later in the Punisher Max series. Frank gets Soap on his side and passing him information on local crime syndicates. Meanwhile, Frank holds up in a dilapidated apartment building with three neighbors, Joan the Mouse, Mr. Bumpo, and Spacker Dave, who, despite Frank's sincere efforts to dissuade them, all end up becoming loyal friends and helping him in his crusade against the Ganuccis. Of course, they didn't go out on missions with Frank, but when the Ganuccis found out where Frank lives, they staged an attack. Dave Spacker himself suffers torture at the hands of the Ganuccis, his piercings ripped out of his face in a fruitless attempt to gain intelligence on Frank. But because of that sacrifice, Frank is able to continue to dismantle the Ganucci crime syndicate. This dismantling ends in a hilarious scene where Punisher throws Ma Ganucci into a pit with a polar bear who eats her arms and legs off and bites her on the head. And then while she's armless and legless and stuck on her bed, Frank lights her house on fire, which I just thought was awesome. And then as Frank is walking away, Maganucci somehow dives out of the window at Frank like snarling, like some kind of crazed slasher in a horror movie, and he kicks her back into the fire. Now, maybe I'm morbid, but that scene just cracks me up. Afterwards, Detective Soap is promoted to police commissioner, and as a gesture of thanks for aiding him, Frank gives his neighbors a large sum of Ganucci money. Joe and Spacker would later play larger roles in Frank's life. Bumpo suffers a medical accident, something important fell out of his bottom, as they say, and moves into a hospital.
Oh, that's just such a great story. Welcome Back, Frank starts off with a bang, and it's a fun action thrill ride. What I find amazing about this story is that it's this good, and Ennis hadn't even found the book's full potential yet. At this point, Ennis was still treating the book as an action comedy, and he was just having a lark with the whole thing. And yet it's still Punisher at its best. The Ennis humor is there, but it's not overplayed. The Punisher as a character is played straight, and you get so many crazy moments. The polar bear scene is the kind of thing you'd only find in an Ennis comic. But there's some really touching moments too, like when Joan the Mouse finally builds up the courage to leave New York like she's always wanted because of Frank's encouragement. The supporting cast was pretty solid in this. The villains were bizarre and compelling, and Steve Dillon always delivers the goods on any Garth Ennis script. Dillon is probably still to this day among my favorite Punisher artists. I can't praise this story enough.
I second that wholeheartedly.
Okay. Well, I'll briefly talk about the Marvel Knights Punisher ongoing series. While I didn't enjoy it as much as I did Welcome Back, Frank, there are still some few stories from this era that are worth noting. Do Not Fall in New York City deals with people who have fallen through the cracks, including an old war buddy who saved Frank's life. Downtown is a particular favorite where Frank Castle goes into Northern Ireland and deals with the craziness going on in Belfast. It's pretty clear that Ennis had some issues to work out with the old home country. The Elektra issue is pretty solid too, as is the Brotherhood arc that deals with police corruption. You get some good, meaningful stories here and there, even during Ennis's Looney Tunes phase. While the MK run wasn't bad, you could tell that Ennis himself felt like he wasn't writing the book to his potential. There was more that he could do with Punisher with the breaks off, both creatively in terms of how far he could go with the content. Ennis's solution ushered in a whole new era for Frank Castle. Mike, do you want to talk about that?
Sure. Marvel Knights was followed in 2004 by my favorite ongoing Punisher series under Marvel's mature readers imprint Max, where the Punisher is in his late 50s, but is even more brutal, cold, and violent. This was, of course, helmed by Ennis, but Steve Dillon didn't come back until Punisher was relaunched in 2009 under the title Punisher Max with Jason Aaron. Ennis instead worked with a series of artists, including Louis LaRosa, Leandro Fernandez, Dougie Braithwaite, I hope I said that right, Goran Parlov, Lan Medina, and Howard Chaykin. But Ennis himself would leave the title at issue number 61 when it was picked up by writer Greg Hurwitz, who was joined by artist Lawrence Campbell to do a 5-issue story arc. With issue number 66, the series was retitled Frank Castle the Punisher, with writer Dwayne Straczynski and artist Michael Lacombe coming to the series. Victor Gischler came on board for the storyline Welcome to the Bayou in issue 71 through 74 before the title finished with issue 75, which was a double-length issue with stories from Thomas uh, Piccirilli? I don't know how to say that.
Piccirilli.
There you go. Greg Hurwitz, Drain Straczynski, Peter Milligan, and Charlie Huston.
Yeah, I will point out that Dylan did come back with Ennis for one last story, and that was a Punisher Warzone MK mini called The Resurrection of Manucci. But I'll add a few minis and one-shots that were also part of Ennis's Max run. Ennis did a short mini featuring Barracuda, one of the standout villains of his Punisher Max run. He also did 3 one-shots that were collected, including Punisher the Cell, Punisher the Tiger, spell of the Y, and Punisher the End. Ennis's last Fury maxi series called Fury My War Gone By also had various small Punisher tie-ins, including a team-up with Frank and Fury in Vietnam, and an issue featuring what Barracuda was up to in the 80s. And then after Ennis left the Punisher book, there are minis he did later, including Punisher the Platoon, which we talked about a little bit, and Punisher Soviet. I figure we may see more Punisher Max stories added in miniseries format as Ennis and Marvel decide to put them out.
Yeah. Despite all of the changes in personnel with the Punisher series under the Max imprint, it had so many good trades in it that it would actually take a long time to go through them all in detail. While I have not read the entire series, some of my favorites include Punisher Volume 7, Man of Stone, where on the barren plains of Afghanistan, the land that swallows armies, Frank Castle confronts his sworn enemy, General Nikolai Zakharov, aka the Man of Stone, a name given to him because of his propensity to be hard and cold like a stone. Neither the General or the Punisher will stop until the other is dead. But also in this mix is CIA traitor Rollins, who is the blackest of black operators. Castle has allies of his own, but in this old bad country, when you go to war in Afghanistan, everybody dies.
Yeah, how true that is. I've read everything that Ennis did, but I haven't read any of the later runs, so I can't speak to the quality of those. But Man of Stone is a really great story, though, and I'd include General Zakharov as another of the really good villains that Ennis introduced during Max, and there are several of those. It's always good to see Punisher involved in a modern war story, and the General was a good adversary for those kinds of stories.
He is a great villain, and I think it's in part because, at least from the outside looking in, like if you don't know Frank, Frank too can appear to be as a Man of Stone.
Mhm.
Another one that I really like is the very first volume in the beginning. There are some great kills and characters in that one, and also a retelling of the Punisher's origin story starting in 1976. The new version goes like this. During a picnic in Central Park, the Castle family are caught in the crossfire of a mafia hit. 9-year-old Lisa, 28-year-old Marie Elizabeth, and 4-year-old Frank Jr. are killed in the crossfire. Only Frank Castle survives, and fueled by this tragedy and his experience at Valley Forge, he turns himself into the Punisher and begins his quest to make the world sane again. One of my favorite scenes was in the very first issue, where we see the local mafia family having a lavish party to celebrate the 100th birthday of Don Massimo Cesare. As every crime family in the nation has sent a representative, the party is unguarded. The Punisher strikes the party, simply walking in and shooting the Don in the head. When the gangsters give chase, they run headlong into the Punisher's pre-prepared chain gun, and he kills everyone in his line of sight. Those that try to strafe him find themselves stepping on landmines. A version of that scene actually ended up in the Punisher Warzone movie, the one where Punisher just walks into the house during the birthday party, gets up on the table, and walks over to the boss and boss of all bosses and just slits Don Cesare's throat. Though in the movie, Frank kills everyone in that room rather than letting them chase him outside into his trap. But the basis for it was still straight out of the book. A basic synopsis of that story would be that nearly 30 years into his mission, Frank Castle comes to the attention of CIA officer Robert Bethel, who's setting up an outside the law strike force to hunt down America's enemies. After the Punisher strikes at the Mafia, his former partner Linus Microchip Lieberman helps Bethel capture him so they can attempt to recruit him for the team, which he refuses. We already talked about how that ended with the shotgun blast to Microchip's head from the Punisher. By the end of it all, Punisher takes a big chunk out of the Mafia's men, almost eliminating an entire family. In that story, Punisher mentions that those responsible for his family's fate were long dead, which means that the events of the Cell One shot, where Punisher breaks into the prison and kills off the old Mafia bosses who were responsible for the deaths of his family, took place before the events in the beginning. Also, on the tombstone of Massimo Cesare, Cesare's year of death is listed as 2004, confirming that the events of in the beginning also take place in the publication year of the comic.
Okay. In the beginning sets the tone for the series beautifully. Ennis made a huge shift in what the Punisher was when the book went max. Ennis started, by his own admission, taking the book seriously instead of writing it like an action comedy. He took the book into full-on urban warfare, showing what a true war on crime would look like. Even by Ennis standards, some of the stuff in Punisher Max gets pretty brutal and nasty, which is what the book should be, really. The first issue in the raid on the mafioso's birthday party is still pretty shocking with how far Castle is willing to go to kill these people. It is a straight up massacre. But of course, the best part of this arc is Punisher having to face his old friend Micro one last time, and the emotional conflict is very well handled there. And it introduced Nikki Cavell, who is one of my favorite villains in this whole run.
Cavella is a great villain, and one that actually comes up again later in the series, but we'll get into that in a minute. Um, my next favorite from that run was actually Volume 2, Kitchen Irish. I found a great synopsis for the series on MarvelFandom.com, and it goes like this. After a Hell's Kitchen bar is blown up, which the Punisher happens to be in, he is drawn into a gang war between four Irish gangs vying for $10 million supposedly left behind by Nesbitt, a former gang leader who made all of their lives hell during his life. Competing for the money are the Westies, the River Rats, Finn Cooley, and McGinty, who you see in the Punisher Warzone movie. The last of whom, McGinty, is a literal black Irishman, and he is particularly ruthless, kidnapping the Westies' leader to send parts of him to his gang to scare them. Each gang was given a part of a code, forcing them to cooperate to retrieve the money. Finn Cooley, meanwhile, is being hunted down by M16 assassin Yorkie Mitchell, who also wants to get his nephew Peter to allow his young partner Andy Lorimer to seek revenge for the death of his father. Since they can't get U.S. government sanctioning, they enlist the Punisher in their quest. After battling each other through the kitchen, only to have a majority of their people wiped out or quit on them, the gang leaders agree to a truce and go for the money together. When they get to where the money should be, they discover a final insult from Nesbitt, wired to a bomb, killing them all. While the Punisher, Mitchell, and Lorimer get away, allowing Lorimer to avenge his murdered father before leaving the U.S. I think my favorite character in this whole arc actually was Napper French, an old man who McGinty forces to cut up Tommy Toner. While he's reluctant to give in to his old ways, Napper eventually embraces it and turns the sadistic table back on McGinty for traumatizing his grandson by showing him what McGinty had been forcing him to do.
Oh, wow. Well, a good arc. Kitchen Irish didn't speak to me as much as it did to you. I'm not sure exactly why, but it was nice seeing Yorkie Mitchell again, though. We last saw him in the Ireland issue of the Marvel Knights run, and he's a character I liked a lot. I think this was just a case where the later story spoke to me a bit more, so I'll just bring up a couple of those. Up and Down and Black is White is one of my personal favorites, mainly for Nikki Cavell. I feel like Ennis spent a good deal of time in Punisher Max improving the villains in the series, and Cavell is one of my favorite ones. Nikki Cavell is a mobster who plays by nastier and unconventional rules, and even the other mobsters hate this guy because of how psychopathic he is and how far he's willing to go to achieve his goals. When Frank kills the rest of the family, Nikki comes back and takes over the organization, blackmailing them, in fact, presenting himself as the only option to being the murdered by the Punisher. He goes after Frank hard, even going so far as desecrating the graves of Frank's family. That is
Damn.
that is a line you do not cross if you want to live. And when Frank finally catches up to Cavella, it is so satisfying to watch. Cavella was a really good villain, and maybe the closest to an arch enemy that Frank's gets in this series. Although Barracuda comes pretty close. The Slavers, as well, is one that grabs me because I think it raises the question of the Punisher's ethics more than a lot of stories. The Slavers are easily among the most evil villains that I've ever seen in a Punisher comic, and that is really saying something for this book. I can't even describe how bad these people are on this podcast. It's that unspeakable. Suffice it to say that I don't think I've ever wanted to see Frank kill anyone as much as I wanted Frank to kill these people. And when he finally does, it's some inventive and sadistic stuff, pushing Frank to his darkest edge. At the same time, Ennis never loses sight of what he's saying with the story. He's giving respect to real victims here while offering some fictional catharsis. These villains are so depraved and so awful that the Punisher is the clear good guy in this. And what does it say about us that we're rooting for him to win? It's an interesting question that I may always wrestle with on some level.
The Slavers might be the most brutal of Garth Ennis's Punisher stories, at least from the ones that I've read. And at the same time, it reveals Frank's heart for the innocent with how he responds to Viorica. That's actually a favorite of mine as well.
That's a good point. We don't often see that side come out, but it makes sense that it would here. Frank is a father, and he has sympathy for children. The fact that there was a baby involved may have moved him. But no lie, I think picking a favorite Punisher Max story is a case where any choice is valid because it's also good. Even the later miniseries that Ennis did after leaving the book were all really good.
I couldn't agree more. It's just an amazing series. But if we can switch gears a little bit, let's talk about the Punisher in film and television. He has made guest appearances on the animated series Spider-Man and the Squad show, where he was toned down quite a bit for family viewers. I personally watched the episodes from Spider-Man, the animated series in the 90s, and it was definitely watered down, but still pretty good considering. The Punisher was also in a great animated movie from Marvel called Avengers Confidential Black Widow Punisher from 2014, where Frank is a bit more in character. The synopsis is this: after interfering in a top secret mission, the Punisher is taken into custody by S.H.I.E.L.D. agent and Avenger Black Widow. At the orders of director Nick Fury, Punisher and Black Widow are sent on a mission to stop Leviathan, a global terrorist organization that plans to sell stolen S.H.I.E.L.D. technology to the highest bidder. Now, the vigilante and spy must work together to prevent this technology from falling into the wrong hands. The fate of the world and the Avengers hang in the balance. I can tell you that it lives up to the hype. While Natasha is great in that, I bought this because of the Punisher, and I recommend it to Punisher fans. Have you seen that movie, Steve?
I'll be honest, I haven't heard of that story until now, but it sounds like something worth tracking down. Maybe it's on Disney Plus. I'm a huge fan of the Black Widow, and I feel like she and Frank would make a really interesting pair. I'll also add that X-Men the animated series gives Punisher a very brief cameo. It's a blink and you miss it kind of thing, but you do see him even though it's an illusion and not really Frank. That show loved to do those kinds of nods when they could get away with it. I also saw the Dolph Lundgren Punisher film, which was dumb fun even if it wasn't the Punisher from the comics.
I Back when I first saw the Lundgren Punisher, it was cool, but really only because there wasn't anything else. You know, that was kind of the case with a lot of superhero stuff that came out back then. It was like, looking back on it, it sucks now, but it was what we had at the time, so we were happy with it.
Yeah.
um, I still haven't watched it again, actually, since I was a boy. I actually kind of jumped onto the Punisher movie bandwagon with 2004's The Punisher with Thomas Jane. Uh, but one thing I really hated about this movie was the change in Frank Castle's past. I mean, he hints about having seen Navy SEALs do worse, but they just imply that all that skill came from being an FBI agent, and that just almost ruined the film for me. But ultimately, it was saved by Thomas Jane, who I thought did well and had an otherwise decent story, based in large part on the 12-issue graphic novel Welcome Back Frank that we talked about earlier. The things specifically from Welcome Back Frank are his neighbors, Joan the Mouse, though she just goes by Joan in the film, Mr. Bumpo, who just goes by Bumpo, and Spacker Dave, who just goes by Dave. Just like in the comics, the 2004 movie has Spacker Dave end up getting his piercings ripped out in a fruitless attempt to gain intelligence on Frank by gangsters. Of course, it was the Ganucci crime syndicate in the comics, and the Saints, or rather Howard Saint, in the movie. One thing they did really well was the fight with the Russian. That was actually one of my favorite parts of the movie, and another one straight out of the comic. Other than what we've already mentioned, Welcome Back, Frank, or at least another version of the story, actually runs through the 2005 Punisher video game as well.
Yeah, as an aside, I will say that the Punisher video game was pretty good, and it was actually written by Garth Ennis. It's very much Looney Tunes Punisher. Definitely play it if you have a PS2. Now, I think that the movie had good intentions and tried to do right by the character, but in some ways it falls flat for me in the execution. But first, I'll talk about what they did right for me. It's clear that they took the right source material for this film, and it's clear that they had affection for Garth Ennis and Welcome Back, Frank, especially. I also appreciated that they used the torture scene from Chuck Dixon's first Punisher Warzone story. I also really like Thomas Jane as the Punisher. I agree with you there. He's a good actor that I've liked in different things, including The Expanse. I'll also add, as an aside, that if you want to see Thomas Jane really do the Punisher well, there's a fan film he made called Dirty Laundry that's on YouTube, and it's great. I'll also agree about the Russian. It was nice to see him in the film. At the same time, the movie makes very strange decisions from time to time. The FBI agent background really doesn't work, although they do allude to Frank having been in the military before that. I'm not sure why they went with Howard Saint over Manucci as the villain, except maybe that they thought they needed a villain with star power like Travolta. Saint wasn't a bad character, though. I also feel like there are things that are lost in translation and don't quite click. Though they did try to get those things right. I didn't feel like Joan in the film was the Joan in the Mouse from the books. There were also times when I thought they were aiming for Ennis-style humor, and it just didn't land right. I don't dislike this movie, and I usually try to give credit when they try to get it right, but it didn't land the way it should have.
I mean, I can certainly see that. That's that's a valid take in my opinion. The next Punisher movie, Punisher Warzone, is actually my favorite, and I honestly would have liked a sequel to it. Ray Stevenson does a great job as Frank Castle, in my opinion. Was he John Bernthal? No, but good nonetheless. And I think that is in part because prior to filming, Stevenson read every issue of the Punisher Max series that was available, and even underwent endurance, martial arts, and weapons training with former Force Recon Marines and film fight choreographer Pat Johnson. He got a taste of what Frank went through training wise anyway, and I think it helped. This movie, unlike all of the others, seems to understand what a Punisher movie needs to be. I also love that LBJ and Jigsaw were the bad guys in this. Jigsaw in particular is a great villain for Punisher. Plus, this is nice and gory, just like a Punisher movie should be. The basic story is this: waging his one-man war on the world of organized crime, Punisher sets his sights on an overeager mob boss, Billy Rizzotti. After Rizzotti is left horribly disfigured by Castle, in a pretty nice scene, actually, getting all ground up in the glass there, he set out for vengeance under his new alias, Jigsaw. With the Punisher task force hot on his trail, the FBI unable to take Jigsaw in, Frank must stand up to the formidable army that Jigsaw has recruited before more of his evil deeds go unpunished.
Yeah, I agree with you that Warzone was a much better movie than anyone gives it credit for. It takes a lot of cues from Punisher Max, including the massacre at Cesar's house. There are a lot of references to Max characters, including McGinty and Cavella's minions, Pitsy and Ink. I was a bit disappointed that they conflated Nikki Cavell with Jigsaw, but in fairness, Jigsaw really worked in this movie. Dominic West really did a great job as the villain of the film, and honestly, he could have been Nikki Cavell too. I'll also add that I like Colin Salmon a lot, and I enjoyed watching his character in this film. Wayne Knight was a pretty solid micro as well. My only real issue with it is, while I think Ray Stevenson did the best with it that he could, I didn't quite feel like he was the Punisher. He just didn't have the presence that Bernthal had to me. But I really respect that he put a lot of effort into making his version of Frank Castle work, and I feel like Castle was well written in this version, and that overcomes a lot in my eyes.
I think I think I can see what you mean about the presence not quite being there. Like when a band does a great cover song, but it just doesn't have the feel of the original.
Yeah.
John Bernthal played the character in the second season of Daredevil and the spin-off The Punisher set in the Marvel Cinematic Universe. In the second season of Daredevil, we find Frank doing another version of his origin story, and again a little welcome back Frank creeps in as Daredevil is chained up with his finger on the trigger of a gun that is taped to his hand as they argue about the system versus execution as a means of justice. Later on the series, Frank ends up getting captured and tortured by Finn Cooley, the guy from Punisher Volume 2, Kitchen Irish. But of course, Frank escapes and kills everyone. Later on, Frank allows himself to be captured by the police and is sent to Rikers, where he fights an entire gang in the hallway of the prison block and slaughters them all in one of the greatest fights in comic book movie history, in my opinion. Ultimately, John Bernthal became the ultimate Punisher actor in Daredevil Season 2.
I'm still not far enough in Daredevil to say exactly how well the story is handled, but I did see the first episode where Bernthal's Punisher appears, though, and it's outstanding. I feel like they got Castle's MO down perfectly, and they built him up into a very credible threat for Matt in that story. John Bernthal just brings so much intensity to that role, and I think that's why he shines as Punisher, even if he doesn't have the conventional look. He looks like a man who's single-minded and driven in the moments we see him.
Honestly, I think I love Bernthal's performance so much because, in my opinion, he looks, talks, and acts like an actual veteran. I mean, I really buy into his military background with how he carries himself. But let's talk a little bit about the Punisher Netflix series that followed his appearance in Daredevil season 2. In season 1 of the Punisher series, after having exacted revenge on those responsible for the deaths of his wife and children, Frank Castle, now known by everyone as the Punisher, uncovers a conspiracy that runs far deeper than New York's criminal underworld. In fact, it runs clear back into Frank's past in the Marines. Now he must discover the truth about injustices that affect more than his family alone. In season 2, we find that Frank Castle has been living a quiet life on the road until he suddenly becomes embroiled in the attempted murder of a young girl. As he is drawn into the mystery surrounding her and those in pursuit of the information she holds, Castle attracts a new target on his back, as new and old enemies, including Jigsaw, who tricks him into believing he had killed innocents, force him to confront whether he should accept his destiny and embrace life as the Punisher, which of course he does in his usual fashion with blood and bullets and death. All in all, it was a decent series, though as not as good as the Daredevil stuff, in my opinion.
Yeah, I kind of feel the same way. I haven't seen that much of the show, though I did look at a few episodes. As always, Bernthal is really good, and I feel like he captured a man with severe PTSD after everything he suffered through. I'm not sure I like the deaths of Frank's family being connected to a huge government conspiracy, though. To me, that risks changing his entire motivation if not handled really well. But without seeing the execution, I'll suspend judgment on that. It's weird, but the show didn't feel as much like Punisher to me in the same way that he did on Daredevil, despite Bernthal being involved with both shows. But what I've seen, I guess I agree on it being decent, just a very different take on it. I mean, Bernthal saves a lot for me.
Right, right. It definitely had a different tone to it than what we saw on Daredevil. But actually, I think that's par for the course when we're talking about the Punisher on his own, away from the drama of Daredevil and the series. But that actually wraps up our discussion about Frank Castle, aka the Punisher. I honestly didn't know we had so much to say. But we left a poll on Anchor for you to answer. We'd like to know where you stand on the Punisher versus Daredevil argument. Is the system or the answer, or is it bullets?